Hi, everybody. Thank you for that, Henry. I really appreciate it. Lois Capps in absentia, even though she's really here in spirit, because this is where her heart really lies. Chancellor and Mrs. Yang, the Miller-McCune Pacific Standard family, distinguished guests, and so many dear friends. It's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight. When I arrived at NCEAS, actually 3 years ago this week, I told my staff that if I was going to survive in the very high-pressure cooker world that is Washington, D.C., especially leading a federal agency, they needed to give me some slack and help me carve out time for a few things that were important to me. I told them they had to do 4 things. One, I needed a periodic family fix because my family is not in D.C., so I needed to carve out some time to spend with them. 2, I needed to have a periodic science fix where I could just, forget all the policy and dig deep into the science world. 3, I needed a periodic nature fix, and 4, I needed to get my sleep, and they needed to respect that. Well, it's budget time in D.C. right now, so I'm not doing so well on the sleep front. But here I am with a bunch of other science junkies and part of my family, so I'm a pretty happy camper right now. NCEAS really has been a science fix for me, as well as for many of you and so many countless others. It's really been an astonishing incubator of creativity, a place where ideas are born, tested, nourished, transformed, and then shared. It's been a safe place to push the boundaries, to ask some really tough questions when you weren't even sure that the answers would be forthcoming, and to enlist the fresh ideas and innovative approaches of young scientists. I think NCEAS is probably somewhat like the proverbial elephant, where who describes it depends on what part of NCEAS they have experienced. Tomorrow you'll hear about many of the successes of NCEAS. Tonight I want to draw on my personal experiences with NCEAS to reflect on some lessons learned and then apply them to the challenges ahead. I'll touch on the creation of NCEAS, the outcome of just one of its over 400 working groups, and then conclude with a broader focus on challenges to the funding of what I call use-inspired science. And I'll use slides toward the end, but not at the beginning. So you can just look at this pretty picture and be inspired. And eat your dessert as well. I take great pride in having assisted in a very small fashion with the conception and the gestation of NCEAS. As president-elect, and then past president of the Ecological Society of America, during the conceptualization of NCEAS, I witnessed how a handful of visionary individuals within the Ecological Society and the National Science Foundation seized the moment to convert a vaguely articulated need within the community into a vibrant center that NCEAS became. Jim Brown, Steve Carpenter, Jim Gause, and Scott Collins led these efforts. But as smart as the design of NCEAS was, and it was very smart, the success of NCEAS relied heavily on its initial leaders, Bill Murdoch, Jim Richmond, Frank Davis, with the assistance of UCSB faculty, breathed life and energy into the concepts, acquiring matching resources. Thank you, Chancellor, for all of your work in that regard. Setting operating parameters, hiring gifted talent, attracting strong early working groups, and laying the guidelines for periodic assessment and renewal. UCSB administrators were strongly supportive, and the Science Advisory Board really ensured that NCEAS was owned and operated by the broader community. Ample opportunities to refresh topics for attention and to ensure quality control. And finally, I think that the credit goes to the success of NCEAS for the leaders of the various early working groups that really transformed the potential into exciting advances in science, as well as aids to society. Vision, design, execution, renewal, all absolutely essential, and all there in spades. So our collective thanks to those of you who were there at the creation. The 90s were a particularly creative time for ecology, especially synthetic ecology and ecology in service to society. The ecological community was in transition in the 90s from a sole focus on scientific discovery for its own sake to a dual focus on scientific discovery for its own sake, to a dual focus on scientific discovery and relevance to society. Although a few decades had elapsed since the Nature Conservancy had to break off from ESA because ESA deemed relevance inappropriate for a professional scientific society, that tension between applied and basic sciences was very much in evidence during the 90s within ESA. That tension was palpable, and in many cases, it was very divisive. This tension came to a head when ESA's Research Agenda Committee wrestled with their charge of articulating priorities for ecological research. What should the criteria for priorities be? Just advancing frontiers? Just things of societal relevance, or some combination thereof? The result was the Sustainable Biosphere Initiative, the SBI. Underway as NCEAS was being formed and involving many of the same individuals, the SBI really encapsulated these dual criteria. The SBI was a clear statement that relevance is not a four-letter word. The SBI was replete with exciting examples of scientific frontiers in biodiversity, in global change, and in sustainability, where new knowledge was urgently needed to both advance understanding and address societal challenges. The SBI authors appreciated the extent to which the real world was the cutting edge of science, and were promoting ways to deliver on both the intellectual and utility fronts. But the committee worried, would the rest of the society agree with this new focus? A watershed moment arrived when it was time for the Research Agenda Committee to report on its work at the ESA annual meeting. This was in Snowbird, I think the first time we had met in Snowbird. The committee members were so anxious about whether their dual criteria would be accepted that none of them would help deliver the report to the membership. They would not even be on the stage with the chairperson of the committee, whom they sort of pushed out and then ran the other way. But to our collective relief, the members were aligned with the committee in embracing the dual focus. Accolades appeared for the committee's work, not Rotten Tomatoes, as everybody had feared. The community was coming of age. As NCEAS and the SBI began to have impact, ecologists recognized the need to do much more than simply discover new knowledge and create new syntheses, but also to do a better job of sharing that knowledge with broader audiences. Few policymakers, few business leaders, few journalists, and few NGO leaders routinely read scientific journals. And yet that was where most ecologists communicated their findings. We were talking to one another. And so the 90s also saw the creation of more formal mechanisms to train scientists to be better communicators and to connect their science with policymakers, the media, the private sector, and NGOs. For example, through the Leopold Leadership Program and COMPASS, the Communication Partnership for Science in the Sea. The NCEAS approach proved powerful and resulted in an abundance of creative efforts on diverse topics. NCEAS was, and still is, a very special place. Here in Santa Barbara, where scientists would love to come and spend time working intensely on big problems, unleashing each other's creativity, and enabled by the tech-savvy, informatics-wise NCEAS team that made it so easy to plug and play. It quickly became a mecca for ecology. New young scientists were valued and nurtured. Experienced ecologists blended their expertise with other disciplines. I had the pleasure of co-leading an ambitious working group focused on the science of marine reserves, areas of the ocean that are completely protected from any extractive or destructive activities. We tackled head-on the need to have credible scientific information to guide policymaking and management. When we started, the word on the street among policymakers, managers, NGOs, and industry was that there was no scientific information about the impact of marine protected areas or any guidance about their design. After about 3 years, at the conclusion of the first working group, the team had transformed our understanding of marine reserves, providing compelling evidence of their efficacy and insight into design criteria and considerations. The project also triggered additional syntheses and studies. Governments, NGOs, industry, and academics used the information to create new legislation, design and establish networks of marine reserves, and launch public awareness efforts. Synthetic science led to informed decision-making. The idea for a working group on marine reserves sprang from the NCEAS symposium that I organized on the science of marine protected areas in 1997 in Seattle. The speakers included a manager, an economist, 2 rocky shore ecologists, 1 fish ecologist, and a geneticist. We learned that although over 10% of land area at that time was protected in some kind of parks or reserves, far less than 0.1% of the ocean was protected. We heard good ideas about what MPAs and no-take areas might accomplish. And after reviewing the state of knowledge, it was clear that marine reserves were an underutilized, underappreciated tool to protect biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. I proposed in that symposium a target for no-take areas of 20% of the ocean by the year 2020, simply to draw attention to the need for more attention to conservation in the ocean. The speakers in that symposium got very excited about the potential for working on this topic in much greater detail, and NCEAS was the perfect place to do so. Steve Gaines, Steve Palumbi, and I put together a proposal that was accepted by the committee, and we led the interdisciplinary team that brought together perspectives from physical oceanography, ecology, larval biology, genetics, and terrestrial conservation. We combined theoretical and empirical approaches. Graduate students and postdocs took the lead on multiple projects within the overall project, and they delivered in spades. Many of you here tonight were part of that amazing group. And I want to name the people who are here just to give you a sense of who they were. And I want you guys to stand just so we can have that recognition. Sati Erme, actually, I haven't seen Sati. Oh, yes, Sati. Sati Erme. Sandy Andelman. Sandy, where are you? Sandy Andelman. Steve Gaines, this is in alphabetic order. Leah Gerber. Ben Halpern, Hugh Possingham, Mary Ruckelshaus, and Bob Werner. So there were a lot of other people on the working group, but I think that's all that's here. Did I miss anybody? Okay. So Steve Gaines and Steve Palumbi joined me as co-leaders of the working group. We learned that, on balance, biomass, density, body size, and species diversity increased dramatically when places were protected from extractive activities, especially fishing. Examples from published scientific studies around the world provided concrete evidence and great insight. The information was there, it had just never been synthesized. We documented that there was spillover from a reserve to adjacent waters outside, with potential to replenish depleted fisheries. We calculated that the biggest impact on the area outside a reserve was likely to come from export of larvae and juveniles, but we knew full well that this would be one of the most challenging things to actually measure. We provided rules of thumb, thank you, Hugh, to inform decision-making about design. And we developed the concept of networks of marine reserves, places connected by the movement of larvae, juveniles, or adults. And we shone a spotlight on connectivity as a key issue, and much, much more. There was clearly more to do, and so a follow-on working group led by Lou Botsford and Alan Hastings was proposed to continue making progress. So this one NCEAS working group spawned a plethora of other activities and syntheses. Because of the work done at NCEAS, managers and policymakers went from saying, there's no science, why should we be paying attention to these, to, okay, I can use this. However, the new synthesis didn't jump directly from our working group to managers. Other overlapping players were key to that success. For example, COMPAS, the Communication Partnership for Science in the Sea, and PISCO, the Partnership for Interdisciplinary Studies of Coastal Oceans, joined forces with the working group scientists to find new ways to deliver new scientific findings to audiences that were hungry for them. Funded initially by the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and later by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, these organizations gave public life to the syntheses created by our NCEAS working group. Understanding the need to speak in English, not scientific jargon, and knowing that pictures are powerful communication tools, the PISCO communicators, especially Steve Gaines, Sati Ermay, and Monica Pacino, designed the Science of Marine Reserves booklet, and Sea Studios created a companion video to translate our working group results into effective communication tools. COMPAS created opportunities for scientists, government managers, and NGOs along the West Coast and nationally to examine the findings, to learn about them, to pose questions and new ideas. AAAS symposia, press conferences, and other events provided platforms for sharing the new knowledge. Nancy Barron of COMPAS worked her magic in helping scientists become effective speakers. Thank you, Nancy. The booklets and later websites created to describe the new findings have been particularly popular. We used Communication 101 tools, eye-catching booklet with images that people recognize. We messaged with photos and USA Today type graphics. We provided easy-to-understand facts at a glance and case studies to ground the general findings in places. And most of all, we messaged in everyday language. The success of the booklets and efforts was contagious, with an ongoing series led by Kirsten Grorud-Colvert and Steve Gaines that has produced other booklets for marine reserves around the world. The US, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and most recently for Europe. These user-friendly materials grew into follow-on media, for example, a layer of MPAs on the new Google Ocean. The synthesis of the science of marine reserves, together with a focused communication campaign, really changed the dialogue on marine protected areas and marine reserves. The statewide process in California, called the Marine Life Protection Act, adopted many of the concepts and results from the science of the Marine Reserves Working Group and used them directly in decision-making. These efforts, in turn, opened up new possibilities. The word spread. The scientific community used syntheses to expand its knowledge, and we provided a model for investigating effectiveness of ecosystem-based management approaches. These efforts continue today, with more and more nations understanding the benefits and the challenges in creating and using marine reserves to achieve healthy oceans. Just this afternoon, Hugh Possingham was telling me the progress they are making in Australia, where he and his colleagues have been using this knowledge and others, things that they had developed, to inform their government's MPA efforts. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority is now 34% no-take. Other parts of their EEZ range from 10% to a proposed 50% for a new Coral Sea MPA. And the software that they helped to create is now being used to evaluate projects around the world, MarkSan. Developing as well as developed countries are pursuing no-take and multiple use areas, for example, in Raja Ampat, Indonesia, Chile, Kenya, South Africa, and a plethora of other places. New scientific studies built on our initial efforts to explore use of reserves, not just as a conservation and management tool, but to enhance fishery management and provide resilience in the face of climate change and ocean acidification. And the communication efforts continue to evolve. The January issue of the Harvard Business Journal features a set of papers that are entitled "A List of Audacious Ideas for Solving the World's Problems." One of those audacious ideas was written and proposed by Enrique Sala, who proposes to create fish banks in at least 20% of the ocean. To make his case, Enrique cites the NCEAS working group results, specifically Ben Halpern's analyses of 124 reserves in 29 countries. In fish banks, alias marine reserves, the number of marine species grows by 21% on average, and the fish and other species get 28% bigger on average. Larger fish have more young, and actually that's what is shown in this image from this booklet, where you have coral trout of 3 different sizes, and each of these icons represents 100,000 young that one produces. So letting fish get a little bit larger brings huge increase in reproductive potential. Translation, there's a lot more potential to replenish depleted areas outside of the fish bank, says Enrique. And the number of individuals also goes up by an average of 166%, creating even more potential for spillover as things get crowded inside. Sala points out that fishermen benefit from fish banks too. Yes, they lose money from not fishing inside fish banks, but he cites evidence that spillover more than offsets their losses. In Kenya and the Solomon Islands, for example, he reports that fishermen living near fish banks doubled their income over a 10-year period. And it's well known that marine reserves attract tourists, other sources of income. Chris Costello, Steve Gaines, and Chuck Cook and their students here at UC Santa Barbara are also pursuing novel approaches that combine networks of reserves with rights-based fishery management tools with intriguing results. And the list goes on. This is the power of NCEAS. This single working group jump-started activities that were both intellectually interesting and immediately relevant to big societal challenges. Quantifying impact by publications and citations is important, but it is only the beginning. Multiple working groups have had huge impact. I focused on the one I know well and did a little deep dive there to give you a flavor of what had transpired. But in the course of tomorrow, you will all be celebrating the over 400 other working groups, as well as postdocs, sabbatical programs, distributed graduate seminars, and others. I began by initially summarizing some of the reasons why NCEAS has been so successful. A place to tackle big, challenging questions on societally relevant problems, an environment that is conducive to creativity, a culture that relishes diversity of perspectives, and the opportunity to tap into fresh ideas of young scientists, and more. I personally am profoundly grateful for the opportunity to have been part of this magnificent experiment. and so very sad that its future remains in limbo. NCEAS was one of the best things that NSF ever did. Today, the need for synthesis and analysis is even more relevant than it was 16, 17, 18 years ago when NCEAS was conceived. The NCEAS model has been lauded and emulated, but its potential has just begun to be tapped. I've seen so many topics in my current job at NOAA that would be perfect for an NCEAS working group. And it would give me no greater pleasure than to be able to direct significant resources to NCEAS. I suspect the same is true for many other mission agencies in the federal government. And yet, especially at this time, we face some very, very tough challenges. In a time of downward pressure on federal budgets, it's increasingly difficult to keep already good things going, much less start something new. Science at non-health mission agencies is especially challenging. The scientific community has made a strong case for the importance of investing in science, but policymakers equate science with NSF or with NIH. Often lost in the shuffle is the importance of the equally important investment in relevant but cutting-edge science done in mission agencies such as NOAA and many others. With a mission that encompasses weather, climate, oceans, and coasts, NOAA's portfolio is diverse. In fact, NOAA traces its roots as the oldest and first scientific agency that this country had. 1807, the Survey of the Coast was created by President Thomas Jefferson. In 1870 and then 1871, the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries and the Weather Bureau were added. And then in 1970, those and other pieces were coalesced into the NOAA that we know today. We are a science agency that discovers and uses science to provide services, such as the National Weather Service, and to be good stewards of oceans and coasts. The science part of our mission is strong, but small. Did you know that of the federal scientists that were authors of the third and fourth IPCC working groups two-thirds of them are NOAA scientists? And of course, NOAA funds academic science. But the research part of our portfolio is increasingly challenged in tight budget times. In a January 4th op-ed in Nature, Daniel Sarowitz reflected on the FY12 budget, specifically the different types of research that are funded by Congress. He notes that basic research, for example, what NSF does, has been favorably endorsed through congressional budget decisions. At the same time, Sarowitz sees increasing budgetary challenges for science performed by mission agencies such as NOAA. And he says, quote, "As the current budget crisis unfolds, the erosion of mission-oriented research is likely to accelerate," unquote. That certainly has been my experience. 2 days after this Nature piece, Science published these data on the percent changes in various agency budgets from 2010 to 2012 of the research enterprise in different agencies. This article flags an important challenge for us. NOAA's research line budget is among those that had the biggest decrease from 10 to 12. It's becoming clear to me that many policymakers think that they do not need to fund mission agency science, that science writ large is in good shape with favorable decisions on NSF and NASA. These patterns and my conversations in DC lead me to think that the community, we need to rethink science funding in the US. NSF needs all of its funds and more, but it cannot and should not support much of the fundamental but relevant science that has been the purview of mission agencies such as NOAA. Research into fisheries, ecosystem-based management, extreme weather, adaptation to climate change are examples of cutting-edge science that have immediate relevance to real-world issues, just like the science of marine reserves did. Many of us grew up with Vannevar Bush's linear model of research, which divides the research enterprise into two kinds of science: basic science and applied science. I know that early on in my career, I was told that at one point you would have to decide, did you want to be a basic scientist or did you want to do applied science? Basic science had an aura of greatness, of pushing the boundaries of knowledge, of being creative, and of following ideas regardless of where they went. Applied science came to represent routine, unimaginative, cookie-cutter variations on a theme. More recently, and in recognition of the fact that some research does not fall neatly into the basic or applied camp, there have been other suggestions, other analyses, other frameworks of the research landscape. In the late 90s, Donald Stokes advocated for a third type of research to be recognized, what he called use-inspired research. The Stokes model is depicted by the 4 quadrants delineated that you see here, by the quest for fundamental understanding, low to high, and the consideration of use, that is, how practical it is and how relevant it is to a social problem. Pure, basic research is in the upper left, applied research is in the lower right, and the thing that's new here, use-inspired basic research, is in the upper right quadrant. Others have labeled this concept different things. Some call it Jeffersonian science, some translational science. But the concept, I think, is a powerful one and a better description of the real research landscape than the original applied versus basic dichotomy. This use-inspired research is, I think, typical of many mission agencies. And it's the science that many academics are interested in doing, but for which there is grossly insufficient funding. It's science that is relevant to real-world issues, but it's also fundamental, cutting-edge science. Problems, often very tough ones, are defined because they are relevant. And then a rich, creative scientific effort is undertaken to find answers. This was exactly what we did in our NCEAS working group on marine reserves. And it also characterizes the work that much of NOAA does and the work that we fund, for example, on climate change and ocean acidification. In other words, the real world is the cutting edge of science. Now, this in no way undermines the strong need for a continued focus on curiosity-driven science that NSF champions. I'm simply emphasizing that in parallel to that, we need stronger recognition of the importance of also investing in user-inspired or use-inspired science. Vannevar Bush and others may well have assumed that they needn't make the case for funding of relevant research. That would seem like a no-brainer. And that assumption seems to have been borne out for NSF, for example, for NIH or for DoD. What's missing in this landscape, though, is the case for and adequate funding for use-inspired science at other mission agencies. And that's a case that universities and others should be making, along with the mission agencies. Many, but not all of the working groups at NCEAS have delivered spectacular science that is immediately relevant to societal challenges. Other equally strong groups at NCEAS have pushed the boundaries of knowledge without any immediate relevance, and that diversity is what we need. The NCEAS legacy is inspiring. I've given you a window into just one of the many outcomes of a single working group, but hopefully also some food for thought about the future of funding for this and other similar endeavors. So I invite you to pick up your glass if there's any wine left in it. I don't see much wine left in anybody's glasses. Okay, pick up your water glass and raise a toast, raise your glass to the visionaries who created NCEAS and enabled it to thrive, and to those who will help ensure that both curiosity-driven and use-inspired science continue well into the future. Thank you. Thank you all.